Hi everybody. I wanted to make a movie about website design in Flash, in part because I'm sure you have some questions about what a website would be like in Flash. Or maybe you've never even had website design before, so you're just kind of wondering about that in general. Well, where we would make a series of HTML pages if we were going to build this in HTML. In Flash, what we're going to do is use a number of frames in the movie, and we'll just have the timeline jump around to these different frames, and those frames will essentially be our stand-ins for pages. Now, you can build sites all kinds of different ways in Flash. You can have it load individual SWFs up. You can have it you can actually have an HTML page have different parts that are in SWF format that are either disconnected or talk to each other. But we're going to make one monolithic page that's a Flash file and build it from there. And this will introduce a new skill set to us. We're going to learn how to navigate around using ActionScript. And that's the primary reason I'm making this movie, so that you can see what key things you need to think about when you're putting together ActionScript. Now, I'm going to try to feed you just a little bit of ActionScript at a time so it doesn't get overwhelming. So if it seems like I'm giving you a limited amount of information, I am. If you're ready for more, you can always let me know, and I can provide you with more. But for right now, I don't want to overwhelm those of you who have never done any coding before, or some of you have had coding experience with Flash in the past and kind of ran away scared from it. So let me introduce this just a couple of concepts at a time. And again, I'm pretty comfortable with coding in Flash. So if you do want to, if you get this real easy and you want to move on quickly, that's fine. Let me know. The first thing we're going to do before we even open up our actions panel is I'm going to do a couple of things on the timeline that will make our life easier. In this little movie, I'm going to make basically 3 pages that Flash will go to. And I could tell Flash to go to certain frame numbers, frame 1, frame 10, frame 20, etc. But I think what I'm going to do instead is do frame labeling. And a frame label is an easy way for you to refer to a frame in ActionScript. And then the beauty of it is if you move the frame, you don't have to go back into ActionScript and change all your ActionScript to go to a different frame number. So let me explain. So I have frame number 1 clicked, and I'm going to go up in properties and notice that the first thing in property is this label function. So I'll just call this first. And then I'm going to go to frame 10. And by the way, notice that when I did that, I get a little flag popping up here. Now over in frame 10, I'm going to just press F6 to make a new keyframe. And when I do that, notice that first now becomes visible. We can see the label on the timeline, which is real handy. So now I'm on frame 10. I'm going to call this middle. And then I'm going to come out to frame 20 and press F6. And we'll just make an end frame here. And then just so that I can see this last frame label, this last part is unnecessary, but if I wanted to see this last frame label, I'm going to press F5 here. So this isn't a new keyframe, this is just extending the current one. Actually, why don't I do it on frame 29 rather than 30 so it's all symmetrical. There we go. So I have first, middle, and end. And if I ever want to edit those, I can just click back on the original frame, and you'll notice that it's available there in the name. So I could edit these if I wanted to. And here's what I mean about changing the label, or changing the location. Again, pretend that you wanted to move this, and that the middle frame or the middle section had to be longer. Well, if I double click on the end section here, I can just drag that down, And now I wouldn't have to worry about going back into my ActionScript and telling it to go to another frame number. This would be, what, frame 37, 38, as opposed to frame 20. So that's, first off, the huge advantage of using frame labels, is that you refer to the frame label rather than the frame number. You'll see here in a minute what I'm talking about. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a layer in here for buttons, and this is pretty standard. In fact, some people will just have a labels layer. I'll go ahead and follow that concept, but you could conceivably put other stuff on your labels layer if you wanted. But I'm going to go ahead and make a buttons layer now, and my button layer is going to actually persist the entire length of the timeline. We're going to just have one keyframe, and all my buttons will sit around during the length of the animation. So I'm going to click in here and type in buttons. And I'm going to use a couple of buttons. You're learning about making buttons this week, so you could make yours, but for the sake of doing a fast demonstration, I'm going to do a couple buttons out of the components window. So if you go under window, you'll notice that there's a components panel available. I've got it stored. I put components and component inspector next to each other because you use them so often right next to each other. So I'm going to just click on components, and under user interface, the very first component in here is a button. Now again, this is kind of a prefab button. It does some things just out of the box, but it's also, you know, it's somewhat ugly. When you learn about making buttons in the chapter 11, I think you'll find that those buttons can be a lot more interesting than these, but the obvious advantage of using these button components is they're already made. Now, I'm going to just copy these, and like Illustrator, if I just option drag an item, it makes a duplicate of it, and I'm going to just randomly lay these out on the page. Notice that they each say label, and up here right now, instance name, these buttons haven't been given an instance yet. If we look in the library, you'll notice that we have a new item in the library, just one button instance, just one button. Keep in mind that this is, again, the power of symbols. When we use a symbol repeatedly in Flash, it actually just has one reference item in the library, and we're just making slight modifications to that single item, and that's what these instances are. So one thing in a button component that you have available that I like, that is a little trickier if you build your own buttons, is that if we go into the component inspector, you'll notice that there's this section for label, and it says label and then value equals label. So I can click on this, and I'll just title this one first, and notice that it changes now to say first, and I'm going to just do the same thing for these other two. And there's some cool things you can do. You can turn on, if you want a button to be a default button, you can trigger that by having it be emphasized. You can also disable buttons, and you can do that through ActionScript, which is really slick. So, for instance, let's say somebody isn't supposed to click on a button for a while, but you want them to see it. You can turn enabled to false, and that way they know the button's present, but you're giving them a good interface ahead of time, knowing that they shouldn't be clicking on it. Good user interface will always project to the user what they can do and what they can't do. This project that you're working on, if anything, is just a study of creating a user interface. So while you're doing this, I want you to think about what you want the user to be doing. where you want them to go, and you can even make kind of a game out of your site. It doesn't necessarily have to be kind of the standard site where you'd have a standard nav bar. You can create an interface that's interesting to you. Now, of course, I'm screwing that up by saying, hey, I'm going to just use these silly buttons in here, but consider that you could make an interface that is somewhat non-standard. The example I gave in class about this was a mind map. I don't know if you're familiar with mind maps, but basically you draw out a concept and then you have little lines project from it that have all the different little parts of the concept that you can think of. And maybe if this were an interface, as you moused over those concepts, you'd get additional lines branching out that would provide you information. That's an example of one user interface. As the person goes down a branch, they see some of the additional branches. Now, the same thing happens when you look on the web and you see, in fact, here, let me see if I can bring up ACCs. Here's another example of a hierarchical interface. As I'm popping along here, we see these items, but we're pretty used to this, and there's a good reason to be used to it. If you're used to it working a particular way, people will have, if your users are used to working with something a particular way, they'll get through it more quickly. But for this project, consider that you might experiment with interface a bit. It doesn't necessarily have to look like every professional website out there. You might try to come up with an interface that's a little different. That said, you should still be able to navigate around it. Okay, anyway, I've babbled here long enough. So now I have these buttons in here. Notice, though, that they still don't have any instances. So I'm going to go now and name these. And the reason you name things, instances in Flash, is so that you can talk to them in ActionScript. And you might remember this from the first project. With the invisible button, we had to name that instance before we could address it in ActionScript. So I'm going to come in here and I'll just type in these names, and I'm going to name it something that makes sense to you, and then be consistent about it. So I'll just call this button1 underscore BTN. Now you're probably like, well, why are you being redundant here by calling it button1 underscore BTN? In ActionScript code, it's really nice when you're looking through the code to know what you're talking to. You'll see here in a minute what I mean. If we just leave it as button1, most likely somebody would understand that that's a button. But if we labeled it BTN1, maybe you wouldn't understand, or maybe you understand but somebody else opens up the document and they don't understand what that is. So as I'm looking through the ActionScript, I'm not sure, man, what's he talking about? A good standard that has been established is that people will put in underscore and BTN to talk about buttons, and then when they're talking about movie clips, they'll do underscore MC. Now, one thing you might wonder is, well, why can't you just use a space? Why can't I just do that? Here's something to keep in mind. With all ActionScript stuff, things that you're naming in ActionScript, avoid spaces. It'll just cause problems. Avoid spaces, avoid special characters, stick to alphas, numerals, underscores, and dashes. Those are really the limits of where you want to go when you're naming things. Okay, so I named that button1 BTN, come in here, I copied button1 so I can press Command V. Now this could cause, obviously, a problem in ActionScript. If you name two things the same instance name, then you might have problems. And you'll notice Flash lets you do it. I have two instances here called button1. I think that's kind of strange that Flash lets you do it, but it does. I'm going to call this button2, and then we'll rename this one to button3. So here's the intent. The intent is that we'll be able to click on these guys and navigate to these various frames of our very small mini site. Let me go ahead and put in another layer just with some background on it so that we can make sure that we're on the right frames. So I'm going to put in a layer. Oh, and by the way, notice that the button layer here, it's going to persist the entire animation. So that's kind of cool. Unlike HTML, where you kind of have to have a template and it's going to reproduce the same thing over and over, or you use frames, which are frowned upon. In here, we just set up a button layer, and the button layer can persist the entire time. Now, it doesn't have to. I could put in a keyframe here and change my buttons around if I wanted to. But that's fairly typical, to put in a button layer and have that just kind of persist. I'm going to put in a new layer here, and this is going to be in the background, so I'm going to just drag this layer all the way down, and might as well just name it background. And on each of these frames, I'm going to, of course, do a keyframe at the particular spots. I'm going to just add a little bit of artwork so it's easy for me to see what I'm doing. Let's see. So rectangle. I'm going to come out here to frame 10, press F6, so that I've now added a keyframe. I'm going to replace what's on here with some other type of object. Let's change the fill color. Okay, and then I'm going out to frame 20 here, F6. And we'll delete that. Let's put in something else here. Okay, so we now have a visual indicator that we've gotten to different pages on the site. I'm going to go ahead and save this. Okay. Now, if I run this right now, it's going to run just like a normal animation. You'll check it out, see what happens. So it sits and it cycles through these guys. So ActionScript is obviously what controls our ability to get around between these. But while I do it, notice that these buttons just out of the box work. As I mouse over them, they highlight. If I click down on them, I actually see the color change. Now, they don't work right now, so I can click on these all I want and nothing's going to happen. But they're all wired in. I basically just need to kind of connect them. Alright, so now comes the ActionScript part. Before I start with ActionScript, I'm going to make a new layer. And this is another one of those kind of standards that I want you to follow. Make a new layer. It should be typically the top layer. And you're going to call it either Actions or Scripts. It doesn't matter. You could call it thingy-mabob. It wouldn't influence the operation inside Flash. The key thing that it would do is it's a cue for whoever opens this file. Hey, this is where the code is. If you name it something strange or you bury it, it gets really hard for somebody to look in here and see how you've structured the document. Now there are some ways around this, and I'll show you inside of the Actions window. So let's go there. I'm going to bring up the Actions frame. And again, I've kind of customized my environment here, but if you don't like it like this, you can just go under Window and you'll find Actions. And on the Mac, it's Option F9. I'm going to pop this open, and notice with Actions highlighted on the timeline, I have the ability to do something in this window. It has a 1 by it. If I have an object selected instead, it'll say, hey, you can't apply actions to this. In the old days with Flash, before ActionScript 2.0, we're now using ActionScript 3, you could actually attach actions to objects. And in many ways, I thought that was really cool. You'd make a button, you'd click on the button, you'd add an action to it, and when you clicked on the button, you'd tell it, hey, go to frame 5. Really simple and straightforward. The only drag with that was that people started making really complex interfaces. And if you were looking for the actions, you were clicking all over the place just to find all the actions in the document. By attaching all the actions instead at the scene, or on the frame level, I'm sorry, not the scene level, Then you go into a frame and you look at it and you find out what actions are happening on that frame. That's the main reason that they got away from that, is that it works okay if you only have a few little interface items that you need to contend with. When you look at Flash sites nowadays, there's just so much going on that it gets really hard to track if you were to attach all this different stuff to the items. So anyway, that's the long and short of it. If you don't have a frame clicked, you won't have the ability to type in here. If you have something accidentally clicked, you will. Notice that right now I haven't put any ActionScript in here, so I don't see anything here. But once I start typing some code, it'll say actions frame 1 here, and in the scene it'll actually tell me where actions are to. So let's do that. I'm going to just type in stop for my first bit of code. Now I want you to notice, and I mentioned this in the first movie about ActionScript 2 when we did the banner ads, but when I type in something that Flash understands, the text turns blue. That's always a good thing to be aware of. Now there's going to be some things that we're going to put in the code here that Flash isn't going to understand, and that's okay. It'll stay black. But if you're typing a command and it's supposed to be something that Flash understands, like adding an event listener, for example, and it doesn't turn blue, you know that you haven't typed it right. That's a great visual indicator. See, that's user interface. That's good user interface. I know I've done this correctly because of the way that Flash has highlighted the text. Okay, so put in a stop. Basically, this tells Flash now, hey, don't go anywhere. Stick around on this page or on this frame. If I test the movie, it indeed just sits there. Okay, so we've done our first bit of ActionScript. Now, then the next thing I need to do is I need to add event listeners. When you're working in coding, there's two ways of doing coding. There's procedural programming, where we kind of have to look at the whole and we kind of micromanage. We go and ask everything over and over and over. Hey, has anything happened to you? Has anything happened to you? You create what's called an event loop. It's very tedious and it's very easy to write bugs when you program like that. The other type of programming is called object-oriented programming. Now, those of you who have done object-oriented programming will probably grimace as I'm talking about this, but I'm going to simplify this process by saying when you deal with object-oriented programming, basically you have these little black boxes, and the boxes have all the code they need to operate on their own, and you talk to those little black boxes and give them information, they churn it out, and they give you something back. Sometimes you write those little black boxes. Now I'm not talking about literal black boxes, I'm talking about an idea, a concept. Everything that makes that thing work is contained in that box. The advantage of making object-oriented programming is if there's a problem, you can isolate it. You can say, well, it has to do with the way this box is working. So you open it up and you look at the code for that particular object and address it. So when we're talking about addressing objects here, these little guys already have code associated with them. You'll notice that the property for these, since they're components, is movie clip. Movie clips have certain properties that are associated with them all the time. And as we work with this, we just have to address properties that are from the movie clip class. Think of a class as being kind of a generation of an item. So you might have children classes based off of a parent class. So in this case, these components are children classes based off of a movie clip class. All movie clips have certain properties. They have timelines associated with them. They have visibility associated with them. They have X and Y position. So by turning things into an object, well, first of all, it's much faster to program because some of this most of the code, in fact, has already been written for us. We just have to talk to the things. And then the other advantage is we can kind of let them do the work. We don't have to keep coming back around in this loop and talking to them. So to do that, I have to come back here and I have to tell each of these guys to listen for events, so each one of the buttons. So I'm going to come back, I think I still had the name of the button, the instance name in there. I did, so button1 underscore btn. So I just press Command V. Here's a weird thing about ActionScript. If you go under Edit and you choose Copy, it doesn't work. Let's try it. I did this in CS3 and it never worked. So if I go under Edit and choose Copy, and then press Return and go under Edit, notice that it has Paste in Place. It doesn't do anything on the main timeline here. Now if I click down here and press Command V, nothing happens either. So when you're doing this weird thing in ActionScript, if you need to copy stuff, you're going to press Command C to copy and Command V to paste, or if you're working on the PC, it's going to be Control C and Control V. But anyway, we're starting here, button 1. What we want to do is tell it to start listening for an event. So when you address an object in ActionScript, you address it by stating its name, and then you put in what's called a dot notation. We put in a period, and when we do that, this whole great big list pops up. This pops up because this button is checked. If it doesn't pop up for you, click this button once and it will. When I do that, there's a whole bunch of things that become available. It says, hey, button 1, okay, well, there's all kinds of things I can do. Some of these things are properties. So, for instance, the alpha property, if I go in here and say button 1 alpha, and I type in equals, I think it's 0.5, I think you go by decimals here. Let's save this and run it. Notice that button 1 fades back 50%. So what I did is I just told it to set one of its properties back a little bit. Now, that's not adding an event listener, so I got a little off track here. So I'm going to come back, button 1, and again, if I type the dot, it opens up. Well, here's Add Event Listener. I can just double click that, and it automatically puts that in blue and puts in a left parenthesis. What I'm going to do is send it a couple of parameters here. The first parameter is going to be what it's listening for. Now, I happen to know how to spell this, so in the beginning what you do is you just copy somebody else's code until you start to know how to spell things out. It's going to be a mouse event. And notice that it's in camel case, meaning that it goes uppercase, lowercase. If there's a second word, it goes uppercase and then lowercase again. So it's a mouse event. And then what kind of mouse event? Well, it's going to be a dot notation, right? We're going to put in a dot, and it's going to tell us what kind of mouse events there are. There's buttons down, cancelable. You can have all kinds of different things in here. But what I want to choose is click. Alright, so I'm telling button 1 to listen for a mouse click. So it's going to wait around until it's clicked. So that's the first parameter. The second parameter that goes into an add event listener is, well, what do you want me to do once I'm clicked? So to do this, when you're putting in parameters, you separate them by commas. And then the second one, I'm just going to call it nav handler 1. Now notice when I do that, it does not turn blue. Flash is like, okay, well, you're going to tell me what nav handler is, and if you don't, I'm going to yell at you. So that's what's happening here. I'm going to put in a right parenthesis because I'm finishing this little command. I'm done sending parameters here. And I'm going to put in a semicolon. And again, the reason we put in semicolons is to separate the commands that Flash has to deal with. We could conceivably put all of our lines, all of our stuff up on one line like this. It gets really hard to read that way, so by putting in semicolons, we can now put in returns between lines, so it makes it a lot easier to read. Alright, so we've got button 1 add event listener. Now I'm going to just cheat. I'm going to highlight all this, copy it, press return, paste it in, press return, paste it in. Okay, I'm going to do button 2. So we have to add event listeners for all 3 buttons. And we're going to have nav handler here, I'm going to do it the quick and dirty way. So I'm going to just make nav handler 2 and nav handler 3. Down the road here, I'm going to show you a way of creating one navigation handler, and it will look at what's being sent to it and do something different based off of all those things. But since we're just getting started, I think it's a lot easier just to build it this way. Okay, so we've added the event listeners. Now if I save this and run the animation, oh wow, look at this. I'm getting a great big error. And this is a great way of understanding when you get errors in Flash. When it just runs through the animation, you know something's gone wrong. And also notice there's some compiler errors here. If I close this, notice that it says, hey, access of undefined property, nav handler 1, and sure enough there's another one, nav handler 2 and 3. Remember when I told you that Flash was going to get grumpy if I didn't tell it what these were? Well, this is how Flash gets grumpy. It issues compiler errors. And when it issues these, one easy thing, I mean right now it's easy to find, but if you double click on these, it'll take you directly to the line that has the error. So that's a great thing to remember. So we have to define these nav handlers now. So I'm going to go back into the ActionScript. I'm just going to press return. And we're going to define what's called a function. So I'm just going to type out function. And if I spell it correctly, it turns blue. Flash understands what a function is. And now I have to make sure to spell this exactly the same way as I spelled it up there. So function nav handler 1. Many errors occur. Well, there's all kinds of different errors that can occur. You could have you could forget to update the numbers on your buttons. So it's all button 1, AddEventListener. I had a student do that on Monday night. And the first time he pressed the button, it did nav handler 1. The second time he pressed the button, it did nav handler 2. So what it was doing was just cycling through these event listeners. So it's very important to double check everything. ActionScript is case sensitive. When you see function spelled this way, it has to be spelled lowercase. Just always do these little things and your life will be easier. So we're going to define nav handler. And we're going to do two things. Remember when we had a parameter, when we specified a parameter? Well, now we're going to specify the parameter that nav handler is going to receive. Nav handler, since we received a mouse event and we're trying to figure out what to do with it, we're going to send that mouse event on to nav handler. If we don't, it's going to complain to us. Okay, so I type in mouse event. I don't even have to tell it it's a click. This is, up here we're waiting to find out what kind of mouse event it is. We might have different event listeners for the same button. We might have a mouse over, a mouse click, a mouse down. You might have all kinds of different ones. But in this case, when we're defining our function, we just have to tell it what kind of thing is being received. Mouse event. We don't have to be any more specific than that. Notice that that thing is encapsulated in parentheses. You can send multiples. If I put in commas here, I could have it receive multiple parameters, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to have one parameter because we've only received one parameter. Then I have to tell it what kind of thing it's going to return. And you do that by putting in a colon after the parentheses, after the parameters. And I'm going to just type in what type of thing it's going to return. It's going to be void. So this function is returning nothing. Some functions, for instance, let's say you did a math function and you wanted to give a function two numbers and you wanted it to return the result of adding those two numbers together. You could have it return instead a number. But for this case, it's not going to return anything. All it's going to do is go to a different point on the timeline. So that's why we type in void here. And then when you type in a function or if you do conditional statements, basically things that should be grouped together, instead of using parentheses, we use braces. So braces, I'm talking about the little curly doohickeys right next to the P key. So I'm going to hold down Shift and press the left brace. And then the way of defining this is now I'm going to press Return and put in a list of what I want it to do. Well, when button 1 is clicked, I want it to go to a particular point on the timeline. If we come down here and look on the timeline, it's going to be that first frame, that label that we did right at the beginning. So I'm going to pop this open, and I'm going to say go to and stop. And go to and stop receives one thing. It receives, well, actually it can receive two, but in this case it's going to receive one thing. Now we could put in just a number. Remember, I could put in a frame number here, and it'd say, oh, go to frame 1. Great. And that'd be fine. Again, there's advantages to using labels instead. So when you use a label, you have to put it in quotes. This is what's called a string. And a string has to be encapsulated by quotes. So I'm just telling it, go to and stop first. And again, there better be a first label on the timeline or Flash will get mad at me. So I tell it to do this. Now the cool thing about function is you can give it a laundry list. I could tell it to do this. Hey, this is kind of a neat thing. This is called a trace command. If I type in trace and then parentheses, I put in something like, hey, we got there. Or how about we got to first? Now, if I stop it right here, I'm going to get errors. Even if I put in a semicolon and all the rest of it, it's going to error out on me. And the reason it's going to error out is that I forgot to put in the closing quote. In fact, let me try it out. Let's see what happens. So notice it gives all this complaint here. I was expecting this identifier before the end, expecting right parentheses, right brace. So just because you typed all that in, but since we haven't closed that quote up, Flash doesn't get it. So we got to come back here and I got to close this with a quote. Okay. Now, I'm going to update this. I'm just going to copy these guys, this function, and I'm going to just cheat again. Put in my other two functions. So this will be navHandler2. Oh, here's another one that you might have. I'm going to go ahead and run this. Duplicate function. You know, that's another one. If you name two functions the same thing, Flash doesn't like that. So I need to make sure to name these differently. So this is 2. This is 3. And I'm going to update where it's going to go. Middle. And you'll see here what trace does in a second. Trace is really just a way for you to troubleshoot. The end user never sees trace comments. Okay. So now we've put it in, and I believe there are no errors. But again, the way that we can check, well, there's a couple ways. There's all these little things up here, probably wondering what the heck these are. Well, one is to check syntax. If I run that, it'll at least check to see if the script I just typed has any errors in it. Now, it doesn't always catch everything, but it's a good way of going before you test it, but I always just test the movie. Now, I'm going to go ahead and run it, command return. Aha, notice we don't have any compiler errors this time. Now if I click on first, notice nothing happened here, but in output we got this trace thing. It said, hey, we got to first. If I click on middle, not only does it go to that middle frame now, but we also get this trace comment, we got to middle. And end, if I click on that, it'll say, hey, we got to end. So what trace does is trace gives you some feedback while you're working to see if you actually got what you were expecting. It's very handy if you're having Flash do some kind of work with variables, or you're having it calculate numbers and you're not quite sure if your work is right. You can have it give you the results, and then if the results are within the parameters you thought, then you know you're on the right track. So traces are kind of cool commands. They're good for troubleshooting, but when you publish your movie, I'll close this up. Check this out. If you publish your movie, if we go into Publish Settings, and go under Flash, there's a little button here, Omit Trace Actions. And by clicking this button, even if you've got 5 million trace actions in your code, it'll turn them all off so that the end user wouldn't see any output. And typically you want to have that checked. I don't know why this isn't checked by default, but that's what this means. Okay, so now we have a running movie, and the key of it is that each time it's going in and it's going to each of these different frames, and notice that instead of go to and play, it's stopping. So we didn't have to put in stop commands all over the place. We can just tell it to stop on these individual frames. I'm going to do something what's called commenting out a line. I'm going to click on the line that I want to comment out, and I'm just going to click this second little apply line comment. If I do that, it just puts in 2 forward slashes, and it turns gray, meaning that Flash is just going to ignore this code. Now, the reason you want to put in comments is that you might come back and write ActionScript now that seems perfectly logical, and then you have to come back and edit it a year from now, and you have no idea what you put. So you might put in here comments ahead of a function. So for instance, I can just type 2 forward slashes, and just say something like, this function goes to frame first. Alright, it's pretty straightforward, right? We know that it's going to do this anyway, but you could write a description in here that would go on and describe what your function does, especially if it's an intense function that does a lot of other things. And sometimes I'll also say stuff like, this function receives a mouse event and returns nothing. Or sometimes I'll put in comments that say which function calls this function, or maybe there's multiple functions. So if I'm trying to debug something and I'm trying to figure out how do I get to this function anyway, if I write in the comment ahead of time, rather than having to pop open a debugger and run through it and do all this technical crap, I can just read what function calls the function in the first place. Maybe this function calls some functions. I could do all of that stuff just by writing a comment. The other kind of comment you can write is this first kind here. If I click this button, I get a forward slash asterisk asterisk forward slash. The advantage of this is if I type in multiple lines, then that comment will persist during the life of it'll persist inside of those 2 brackets. I guess you could call them brackets. Notice that if I leave this here, Flash will again get mad at me. Syntax error, has no idea what the heck I'm talking about. So the first thing, or the main thing to remember about ActionScript is it gives you an appreciation for human ability to understand language. We have all kinds of flexibility. When somebody tells us something, we have all kinds of ability to analyze that and consider whether, if you don't quite understand it, you probably within a millisecond restructure it and put it into a format that you understand. Software programs are not that smart yet. You have to be extremely literal with software programs to get them to work properly. And there's a blessing in that. You have to think logically and write logically as you go. But it does require some discipline. So anyway, now we've got this little thing, and basically we can navigate around, as we've seen before, between these guys. And just imagine having a little website, that was 3 pages, and instead of having these little guys, we would have text describing stuff. You might have movie clips that are running on the site. All kinds of, you might have a noise that goes off at that part of the timeline. All those things can happen. I would also encourage you to experiment. Let me comment these lines out so that we don't get the traces anymore. When we're looking at this, I want you to experiment with a couple of other things we can do. We can do, instead of go to and stop, we can go to and play. If I put in play, I'm going to come in and make a slight adjustment to the timeline. So in our timeline here, I'm going to tell it to go to and play, and let's see, we have our background, and instead of having just the keyframe persist the whole time, I'm going to put in a second keyframe here, F6. Select our object. Let's just distort the object a bit. And I'm going to do a shape tween between these guys. All right. So now it would go to and play. And then what do you think will happen here? Let's watch. I'm going to save, run it. If I click on first, so it cycles through, comes back, and then it hits that stop command. So what we need to do is we need to put in a break before it goes to all these other guys. So maybe we want it to cycle through and end at the end of the animation. In that case, we would put in a stop command right here, right prior to the next frame. Or maybe we want it to do the animation and then go to the next frame. And in that case, we put in a stop command here. So let's do that. I'm going to just come in here and bring up our actions. Notice that since I have that selected, I need to press F6 to make a keyframe. Now we have a new action. Go and type in stop. It's not going to be stip, be stop. There we go. And I'll just copy this so we can remember, because it's so hard to type. And come over to the last frame, F6. Oops, I put in too many. I'm going to remove that keyframe. There we go. And here I'll put in stop as well. Notice that when you put in ActionScript, it shows up with a little A in here. And again, actions should just only have actions on it. That layer should only have actions. It shouldn't have other stuff. If you see black dots or shape tweens or motion tweens, that's really kind of cluttering up your timeline. You want to have actions just kind of hang out on its own. Now, labels, we could put this anywhere. We could put it underneath background. We could have it above. It doesn't really matter. And some people will just build their stuff right on the label layer. That's okay. But let's try this now. Okay, so we've done this. I need to make a couple of other adjustments. So I'm going to come back here and put in another keyframe. Expand that out. Do another shape tween. Here's our last one. And put in our shape tween here. Alright, so we've got stops on all of these, so I think it's ready to go. So now we've got go to and plays instead of go to and stop. And what this does is it allows us to run these little initial animations, and it goes on to the next one. There we go. So, here right away is one powerful reason for using Flash in comparison to a web, HTML to make a website. You can have little introductory movies. This is pretty straightforward. It's interesting though. I wonder why it's now not playing the shape tween. That's weird. I have to troubleshoot that one down the road. But in any case, the key point I'm making is that there's stuff that you can have in Flash that obviously you don't get in typical web design, and that's why you guys are all taking Flash. But again, the other reason you have these, the reason why people don't like Flash is because now they have to troubleshoot something like this. That's very frustrating. So we'll have to figure that out. Let's see if there's an easy answer for this. Or we can just sit there and be befuddled a little bit. So it's going to and playing. It should go to and play each of these guys. I wonder if it's because stop is persisting now. Is that it? Is that what's going on the timeline? Let me test it one more time. First, there we go, middle, and comes back and stops here. Now it's working. Let's go back to first. Well, that's even stranger. So it fixed itself. Right when I was telling you that Flash is completely logical and needs all of your help, it fixed itself. You saw it here. It wasn't working, and now it is. So there you go. That's the fun of doing ActionScript. I hope this video was more helpful than befuddling for you. Key thing is play around with it, and the main thing I wanted to get you to get the idea of was the idea of interface, and that when you're making web pages, in quotes, what you're really doing in Flash is just going to different frames or maybe even different scenes. We'll get into that stuff later. By the way, if you got the optional text, the Adobe Flash CS4 Classroom in a Book for ActionScript 3, if you read the first 2 chapters in that book, they cover kind of this navigation stuff very well. So if you do have that book, that's a good place to start in terms of reference. Let me know as you get questions. I'm not going to say if you get questions because I'm assuming that at some point you will have questions. Just let me know and we'll work our way through it. By the way, when you have a question, a lot of times it helps if you'll email me the FLA file. And again, the email tool inside of Desire to Learn is pretty crappy. So just email my standard email address, tom.demoulin@arapahoe.edu. And again, you see that all over the place on the site. So just email that location and I'll have a look at the code and see what's going on. Okay,